Sikhs from around the world by showcasing their professions, passions, and perspectives. I'm your host, Mandheer Singh, aka the Nihung. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ.
Keerat Kaur, welcome to the Net Nihung's arena.
Yay, I'm excited to be here. It's going to be fun.
No, I'm excited to have you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this is, for everybody listening, Keerat Kaur is my niece. It's my wife's sister's daughter.
Yeah.
And I've actually known you ever since you were born.
Yeah. You were in Dayton, right? Like for the few years. Yeah.
Yeah. When your mom had moved to Dayton for work, the Dayton area. And we were, we knew you guys we actually knew your family a couple of years earlier. We had met at Smoggums.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. But, your mom moved to Dayton, newly married. And, we used to spend time with them because we kind of knew them from before. We'd see them at Gurdwara or whatever. And then you were born. We saw you when you were born. So it's kind of funny. I've known you your whole life, but it wasn't until much, much later that I got married to your Masi.
My aunt, which we all knew was going to happen before you guys did.
Yeah, before we did.
Yeah.
It was so obvious to everybody else.
Yeah. I was like 10 years old. And I would talk to my mom and be like, when are they getting married? Yeah.
That's funny. But yeah, even though you might say Jasu Masi, I've now taken on the nickname of Uncle Rick.
Yes. I feel like it suits your personality really well to not go with the traditional Ricky Masarji. It was weird transitioning from Ricky Virji to Ricky Masarji because I remember that's what we used to call you. Yeah. And then now it's like, okay, Uncle Rick that is who you are. So that's what we've all started calling you.
That's funny. So you recently got married. It was in July, correct?
June.
It was in June. End of June. Yeah. So you recently got married. So how's married life going?
Married life's been really fun. A lot of people, they always say like it's the honeymoon phase and everything, but
sure.
Me and Singjot have actually known each other for like almost 3 years now. Yeah. And so it's married life, transitioning into married life. It wasn't like a huge transition for us.
Yeah, it's very smooth, right?
Yeah. But getting married in COVID, that was an experience.
Well, can we talk about that a little bit? Because I thought it was very neat how you guys did it. Considering the situation, you had obviously had a much bigger event planned before. And then all of a sudden this COVID hits and we were kind of scrambling for what are you going to do now? And you guys came up with a really unique idea, which looked odd at first, but when you went, like during the Lama, it made so much sense. Like it felt like, that's the smart way to do it. Why don't you describe a little bit how you guys set it up and how you actually did the ceremony? Yeah.
So originally we were actually going to get married in Toronto, Canada. And we had been planning, like everything was ready. We had our kirtanis down, it was going to be an awesome like smagam type experience.
Yeah.
And so I remember the weekend we found out that they closed the borders and that we were just so confused. And in the beginning, we didn't even think like, this is real. This is actually happening.
Yeah. And just to point out, you guys are in North Carolina.
Yes.
Toronto is what, 16-hour drive or something?
Yeah. It was a 16-hour drive and we had our flights booked. Some families were driving.
Yeah.
Like there were other people, all of our families, Singhji's families, like everybody had their tickets. So it was really because
people were coming from India, people were coming from the States, people that were in Canada. Yeah.
And they were coming from Australia, like my dad's side of the family, both India and Australia. So it truly was an international wedding that was about to happen. But with COVID happening and everything, we kind of had to decide, it's not possible, first of all. And
you also had to make a decision like, do we want to wait till another year or two until things clear up? Or do you kind of move on with your life now? Like you have jobs to start. You have things that are happening together already you kind of need to move forward. So you had to kind of weigh those two and say, okay, what do we want to do?
Yeah, I had actually, we had just gotten done moving me into our new apartment in March. And that weekend they had announced everything happened. And so we kind of had to decide, like, I just started a new job. I was moved in there. We were going to be getting married in 2 months in May originally. Yeah. And then everything just changed. And so that was the decision we had to make. Did we want to wait till next year? Was it worth doing that? And we ultimately decided, it's a huge thing. Like for me, I still had my family here.
Yeah.
But Singhji's family, like everybody, he had nobody here. Right. And it got so severe that even interstate travel was just, they were saying you had to quarantine 7 to 14 days for weddings to even happen with some of his other family members. And so we, at that time, we were trying to figure out how exactly we want to do it, to the point we were contemplating of doing it in our house. That's how we were trying to think, because at the time gurdwaras were also,
that's right.
It's a hard position.
Yeah, exactly. You don't, and also you have some gurdwaras around the country. The bhais are at the gurdwara, they don't have medical insurance or they don't have resources, and they're also kind of stuck there. And if they were to get infected by all sangat coming, it could be very problematic. So so you guys are actually thinking about doing it at the house. Yeah,
we had gotten to the point where, because he had just started a job, I had my new job, we had to move eventually. Yeah. So it was just, there were so many moving parts to it. But luckily, one of the local gurdwaras had agreed to us doing the Anand Karaj there, and we wanted to make sure it was as safe as possible. So what we ended up doing with the setup and everything, we literally planned this wedding in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
I went from planning a wedding over the span of like 4 months, and now having to change all of that with COVID and do it in 3 weeks. And so my mom, she's a project manager at her job. This is her thing.
This is what she does.
Yes. Yeah. So I seriously, I could not have done it without my mom during this time. Like me and her, we really sat together and tried to plan, okay, what is the safest thing we can do? And so the way we decided, and it looked weird, but it ended up working out, was that every person that was coming in would have their own chadar to sit on.
Like each family unit.
Yes, each family unit would have their own chadar to sit on, which is weird because we are coming from like smagams and kirtan programs. Everybody sits together.
Right.
And we just didn't want there to be any type of contact. And we wanted, I grew up with these kids that we were all around 24/7. And kirtan is really what bonded us together. So I really wanted them also to do kirtan and take part in the Anand Karaj and really get those blessings from everybody. So we had mics at each individual's chadar that was there for the families, because all the kids can do kirtan here.
Yeah.
So we had that. We also had our doors open.
You're saying kids, but we're talking about young adults. We're talking about people that are in their 20s.
College, college kids, young professionals. I call them kids.
Right.
We're like,
I call them kids too, because to me they feel like kids. But we're talking about young adults here. They're all
our North Carolina gang, as I would call them.
Yeah, my kids are the youngest, right?
Yeah.
Out of all your cousins, there's a huge age gap. My Keerat Singh is 11.
Yeah.
And who's the youngest out of your guys' group? They're Save? She's
Save. Yeah, their Save is the youngest, and
what is she, 19 now?
Yeah, I think she's 18.
18, 19, yeah.
So the gap is real between the cousins, but we all all of us grew up around each other, and we wanted to definitely do kirtan together and everything. Right. We actually had, before you entered the Divan Hall, we had bags there that included hand sanitizers, masks, if in case someone didn't bring it, or if they wanted to get rid of it.
Which, by the way, that mask that you guys gave, I think that's probably the best mask ever. I use that still. That's the mask I keep in my truck. Yeah, I keep it in my truck because it's the kind that you can tie.
Yeah.
And with my dastar, my dastar goes over my ears, so I need to tie it. And from all the other masks, I find it to be the most easy to breathe in.
Yeah, it's like I think the fabric itself is very breathable, but it has the full coverage. It goes over your nose onto this area, and then there's 2 ties where you can do if you have it over your ears and below. So we really thought through on all the situations because people are going to come dressed up to weddings, and not everyone's going to have their ears out and stuff. So we wanted to make sure like the things that we had there, people felt safe enough to attend the Anand Cottage, but also to not feel like that it's weird.
Yeah, and that was another thing too. You had to, especially in June, things were still seeming pretty bad. You had to significantly reduce who could come. I mean, even to the point like we kind of just kept saying, we just kind of pushed that we're going to come, because I think part of it for me was, okay, I didn't want my kids to not be a part of it, and they're not old enough to be on their own, right? But we were literally even on the drive down. There's a couple of times where we almost turned around, just came home because we weren't sure what was going to be open, what was going to be safe. But we kind of just pushed through. And then when we got there, it was perfect. First of all, you guys had us set up real nice. You had toys and stuff. And we were, so the kids stayed busy in our hotel room. But at the Gurdwara, we had our own little station. And that was really good because we could all sit together. We didn't have to worry too much about other people being close to other people. And then the Lama got done that way. The Lama got done where everybody stayed at their station. And you guys were kind of yourselves up front. And
we didn't even let people do matha take in the front either. We had everyone, literally they stayed at their stations, did matha take there, brought their everybody brought their own vaja jodi. We didn't, I'm seeing some programs where people are using each other's vaja jodi, but we just felt that we did not want a single person, even potentially, to get sick or anything.
Yeah, at our Gurdwara, we've been doing kirtan programs outside, and what they do is they have wipes and sanitizer, and they wipe everything down between everybody as they rotate. But that was outside. Now it's cold. Now they're doing it. Now that I guess kirtan's going to be inside. But so far, it hasn't been like large Sangat style kirtan inside. We only did that outside.
Yeah, even inside, I believe at our event we had 20 people max.
Yeah.
And making that list was so difficult, trying to figure out who to invite, who not to invite. Like, I remember we probably spoke to Masiji like 10 times before when you guys decided to come, because we were just so scared and nervous. Like, we didn't want you guys to take that risk at all. And we didn't know up till the last minute that, okay, I remember she texted us that morning, like, okay, we're leaving. That's when we found out that you guys were coming, and we just wanted to make sure like everything was safe for anybody that attended. Even when we had, after the Anand Cottage, we had a few more families come. We made sure that the tables were distant enough.
Yeah, because you had lunch at a restaurant, but the restaurant was actually shut down, and it was only open for our program, and each family was at every table. But that's really tough because once things kind of get a little social, then it gets loosey-goosey and you start taking photos and stuff. But overall, everything went really well.
We definitely tried. And I think that, everything happens for a reason. We may not understand what that reason is. We may not understand until a few years down the line. But I really feel like, things happen. Whatever is in Hukam, it's going to happen the way that it is. Yeah. And it ended up being great. Like, the Lama were amazing. We felt that same, everybody talks about like during the Nand Cottage that you'll feel like you're in a daze or it's a surreal experience, but nobody truly understands that until they're in it themselves. Yeah. And we felt that exact same way. And I think that's the biggest thing, like being in that experience with the people that you love in front of Guru Sahib, like that was beyond what we had expected. So it all ended up being good.
Yeah. So you said that you got a new job and you moved to your new apartment. So what are you doing right now? What is your job?
Yeah. So right now I'm working for Red Ventures, and I'm working as an outreach associate. So it's more towards like the marketing side of things, a little bit different from the things that I've done in the past. But
what is Red Ventures? What do they do?
Red Ventures, so they do a bunch of different things, and trying to explain it can be a lot. But
hey, you're in marketing. You better be good at this.
Yes. So Red Ventures owns a bunch of different digital brands in different sectors. For example, there's the moving sector, there's finance, there's health. So we actually have different online companies, different sites. For example, like, I don't know if you've heard of bankrate.com before. Yeah. So that's
use bankrate.com all the time because I'm in real estate. So we use it all the time to do mortgage calculators and stuff.
So we're actually, Red Ventures is partnered with bankrate.com, and we actually have teams that, run their site in terms of content, outreach, figuring out data points, all of that. And so I'm on the moving sector of that. So I work for mymove.com, and I'm part of their outreach association team. And so what we do is, we'll come up with different content ideas, similar to some of the stuff that I had done previously, but just more of using data and just understanding how the moving population works and what we can do to provide more resources for them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So the reason I had you on today, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and you just mentioned some of the work you did previously. Why don't you go into that a little bit and go ahead and give whatever disclaimers or anything that need to be done?
Yeah. So I just want to give a disclaimer that some of the information that we're going to be talking about is going to be about domestic violence, sexual abuse, stalking, and just some sensitive topics. And I wanted to issue a trigger warning to those that may, that may be listening in case they have gone through a situation, or they may know somebody that's gone through a situation. And so just to let people know that those types of topics are going to be discussed. And throughout the time, I may be using she or her to describe a victim, just because 99% of the cases that we had were victims that were women. So it's not to say that a man or someone who is gender nonconforming has not experienced domestic violence. It's just, for majority of these cases, those are the stories that we had dealt with.
So where was it that you worked? And why don't you tell us a little bit about that organization and what you did there? Yeah,
so I had gotten involved in a lot of human rights related work and social justice work early on in my life. And when I graduated college, like every college graduate, I was confused on exactly what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew that it had to do something related to helping individuals in some sort of way. And so I landed upon Kiran. Kiran is the name of the organization that I work for, or used to work for. And it's a domestic violence agency that works with victims of violence who are from the South Asian population.
Okay.
Yeah. And so my role there was a program manager. I tried to help those that were going through different trainings, developing trainings, programs, or anything that would strengthen our brand as an organization with other populations as well. And also because the agency was so small at that time, we were literally, at one point, we were a staff of 3.
Oh, wow.
I had to wear many hats, and one of those was being a case manager. I had my own load of cases of victims that were coming in and managing those cases. So it was interesting because a lot of the work that we did, I never imagined that, I would be working with individuals so closely on real life situations that were going on.
Right. And that changes a lot too, because it's one thing, like people like me, I mean, we hear about these cases, we empathize, we sympathize, we want to do something. And usually the extent of that is maybe a donation or something, because we don't really understand it, or we're not really, unless you're dealing with it, it's hard to, actually understand how bad it could be. So when you had to deal with actual cases, how did that change your perspective on it all? How did that affect you?
Yeah, I think that going into this field, no one can really predict, what you're going to experience or what's going to happen. Domestic violence is something that wasn't completely new to me because I had family members that have experienced it. I knew people personally that have gone through it. But, knowing someone, hearing their stories, again, like you said, it's very different from being in that work day to day. And I think that it definitely takes a toll, but it's also gratifying work knowing that you're making a difference in somebody's life. And I think the hardest thing for me was, there is this idea that we have of what a victim looks like, right? There's oftentimes we think that, they may be women or they may be coming from uneducated families or,
kind of weak and
low,
meek type of persona or something. And it's not necessarily the case.
Right. That's not necessarily the case. This is something that we tell everybody, but domestic violence doesn't discriminate. And I think that was the hardest thing was, seeing that there were victims that were as young as my age. When I was doing those case reports, seeing 1990s come up as their date of birth, I think that was a reality check that this really can happen to anybody. And then one of the oldest cases we had was a woman who was 67. So even in that age, I remember doing her intake. And I think that really set into reality that this is not something that is just affecting a small group of people or, certain populations. There are people that have PhDs that are victims of domestic violence. There are people that come from rich communities that this is affecting. It's not just people that don't have any money or, uneducated families that are getting arranged marriages. And it's nothing like that. It can happen to anybody.
Right. And actually, in a previous episode, a dear friend of mine talked about her experience. And the thing that shocked me was, first of all, I didn't know how bad it had gotten for her. Okay. And that kind of really brought it to reality for me. But the amazing thing to me was she's like the first feminist I knew before marriage, like when we were in college and stuff, she's the one that does gutka. She's the one that goes out and travels the world and shows up for, relief, whenever there's a tragedy and things like that. She is like what you would think of when you imagine a strong, independent core.
Right. And
then to hear her talk about how over the course of a year and a half, it wasn't like all of a sudden, something that came at her straight away where she might've been prepared to fight it.
Right.
It was over time, things slowly changing. And then there's a snapping point. And then there's a point of, can this be real? This is someone that I love and care about. Maybe I did say something wrong. Maybe I did do something wrong. There's a lot of questioning. And then it kind of hits you like, it could happen to anybody. And even for her, it was shocking that he became that way. Like she said that, something, pressure in his life, whatever it was. And yes, he came from a family where he saw that himself, but he had made efforts to not be that way, but it still came out of him. Right. Yeah. So even people you don't expect it from, sometimes they can be the abuser. They just become the abuser. It's not like they're always that way. They can become that way. And then people that are strong and independent can become victims. It's not so clear cut that it's a certain personality type that's going to, nothing like that.
I mean,
so that was pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, there are commonalities that we see, the typical signs of what abuse can look like. They're there, the commonalities that we see. But I agree with you that it's not just one, like, do you have this face of what domestic violence looks like, or this is what an abuser looks like. And oftentimes I feel that people are surprised, and especially in our communities, when we see that such and such person, we heard that, they were doing something or they were being abusive, because oftentimes they will do roles such as be a very great sevadar. They will volunteer at camps or in their communities. They'll have these good jobs. They will come off as charming. People would never think that something like this could be going on at home.
Right.
So I think that that's also important to note, that oftentimes there's a lot of victim shaming, which happens when they see that if there is a woman who's super strong, she has a strong personality. And a lot of people will say, well, maybe you need to tone that down a little bit and just listen to what he wants or what the family wants.
Right. Yeah. I think the other thing too is, especially in our culture, in our community, we don't even necessarily know what the different forms of domestic violence are. Can you cover a little bit about that? Like, what are the different kinds of things, that even things that we don't think of, that actually are forms of domestic violence, even though it may not involve, I mean, cover them all, but even though it may not involve direct physical abuse, it starts in many, not just starts, it can be in many forms that are equally as damaging.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when people think of domestic violence, they just think about physical abuse, that, someone is being physically assaulted or being punched in the face or slapped or pushed around. But there are many different types of abuse, and it's actually been evolving. Even while I was working at Kiran, we were learning about different types of abuse which didn't exist before.
Meaning they existed, but they weren't identified or classified. Okay.
Right. Because so I'll go into the ones that, we're kind of familiar with. So, verbal abuse, that's something that people downplay a lot, because they'll say, a simple argument, if there's some name calling, that's okay, that just happens in marriage. People get upset and they'll say things to each other. But sometimes verbal abuse can get to the point where it's becoming affecting a person's day-to-day basis, where they're being constantly yelled at, or as soon as they wake up, they're not being let out of their homes. There's a lot of emotional and psychological trauma that somebody is going through when constantly being told that they're not good enough. And oftentimes it does start, the first stage of, domestic violence, it starts with verbal abuse. It's saying things that oftentimes people can get away with, like, that you're not good enough, you didn't cook well today. So that's one thing. And it's kind of like
calling somebody stupid, or something.
Calling someone stupid, you're not smart enough, or you don't look good, you're not pretty, you're ugly, you're fat. So all of these things, they start out very small, and it's kind of like the abuser is testing the waters a little bit.
Like, what can they get away with? Right.
So it typically starts out that way. And then when they see that it's obviously starting to affect the victim, a lot of times she will take it upon herself, okay, what can I do? Maybe I am this way. They kind of start to believe that, what the person is saying, maybe it's a characteristic trait that's not good about me, or something like this. And then soon it will go into the emotional abuse, and then the physical abuse.
Well, so wait, stick with that for a second though. What exactly is emotional abuse? How do you define that? What does that look like?
Right. Emotional abuse is affecting somebody's psychological state. So oftentimes when somebody is constantly being taunted or told that they're not good enough, they kind of go hand in hand, that they can affect the emotional state of an individual, where they feel like they are worth nothing. Their self-esteem starts to plummet. They oftentimes will start having extreme anxiety in social situations constantly, because they feel like the abuser is watching their every move. And that makes them feel like they have to monitor what they're doing. It can lead to depression. A lot of times people will go into a state of, they just feel like because they're not good enough, or they're going to get yelled at for doing something, they will only stay in their bedroom. They won't be able to get up during the daytime, or they'll stick to their activities within the home and not go out, not socialize with anyone. They will start retracting from their social circles, their friends, because a lot of times the abuser will say that those aren't your true friends. So it's coercion in a way too. I see. And it starts affecting your mental state to the point where you are not functioning like the way that you were before. Completely, like it's like a psychological control with a flip of a switch. Anything that he says can affect her mental being. Okay. And who she is as a person. They feel like they can't do anything.
So were you guys also helping them treating these types of things, like treating emotional abuse? Because like how do you treat something like that? Like obviously when it's a physical abuse, you can it's more obvious. Hey, you hit her, you go to jail.
Right. Well, but if you call somebody, as simple as that.
Well, no, not maybe. Obviously. But I'm saying like that's something that we can see. But when you say to somebody that, oh, they were calling me names. There's,
Yeah.
there's no consequence. All you can say is, "Hey, dude, don't call her names. What are you doing? Don't be mean." But the damage is done too. Now there's got to be treatment.
Yeah.
With the physical abuse, you can say, "Go to a doctor, go to the hospital, get bandaged up, But what do you do with the emotional abuse?
Yeah. So the emotional abuse, we're able to recognize it much sooner when we see it, because oftentimes they will come in, you will start asking them questions on situations on what happened. And a lot of times they will try to make the situation seem smaller and less serious than what it was. And that can it identifies to us a little bit that, okay, there's some emotional abuse that was going on. And the cool thing about our organization was that we developed a plan for psychological trauma. We had specifically a program that had South Asian therapists.
Okay.
And so they were able to not only talk to them in therapy, but also speak their language. And I think that
which is
that's
huge.
huge.
Yeah, that is huge, because if you have to go talk to a therapist who doesn't understand your language, doesn't understand your culture, you can almost feel like they're never going to understand what I'm actually going through. But having somebody that looks like you, that can speak your language and understands your culture, then all of a sudden it can open your mind to, it doesn't have to be this way, because look, this person who knows me or knows where I come from understands what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that program was very, it was very important to have that, because if you look at a mainstream domestic violence agency, they're not going to understand the specific South Asian culture about that. The abuse may not just be coming from the husband. It could be coming from the in-laws because of joint family households, right? The abuse could be the idea of that the couple had gotten a love marriage instead of an arranged marriage, in the sense that they picked their own couple against the family's will, and now abuse is starting and the victim doesn't want to speak up about it because she got married against everyone else. So a regular mainstream agency is not going to understand, the difference between the love and arranged marriage. The whole concept of dowry, a lot of abuse starts to stem from the beginning of the marriage, where they feel the girl's side did not give enough money to the guy's side in a lot of the cultural families.
Wow.
Mainstream agencies are not going to understand that either. This whole concept of izzat, or the whole idea of honor, that the victim is representing the honor and doesn't want to disgrace the family. You see a little bit of that, obviously, with the stigma of divorce that other non-South Asian cultures have. The other agencies may recognize that, but it's not the same as it is stemming from, the culture. And that kind of brings me to the next abusive situation. So spiritual abuse, that's something that is not commonly talked about, but
never even heard of that.
Yeah. So it's actually something that a lot of people within the South Asian community, if you are getting married to somebody that is outside of your religion, it may be that, a Hindu and a Muslim have gotten married.
Right.
One, they are defying normal norms, like the culture norms of, marrying outside the religion, because that's such a huge thing for us. We know the history between, Hindus and Muslims getting married. That's also something that is a huge taboo in society. Yeah. But then when they do it without, family support, and they get married and abuse starts happening in that situation, a lot of times the abusers will start using religion as a way of doing abuse, or we'll see casteism. Sometimes if someone has gotten married to somebody from a higher caste and a lower caste, they will also use that as a way, as a part of spiritual abuse, by saying, we come from, such and such caste. These are what our values are. This is our norm. Like if a Pandit was getting married to someone who was of a lower caste, they would use that against them as, you are not pure, you're not this and that, and which would lead them to disciplining them.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Sikhs also still carry a lot of that too. We're not above all of this either.
Right.
People use caste against it, or they might even, look at what Jathabandi or whatever.
Yeah.
And they might say, "Oh, well, you did this way all your life, and now you got to do it this way. This is the right way."
Right.
Right.
And we've seen that. I mean, we can take like it's an example of someone who may be coming from a very strong like AKJ family.
Yeah.
And if they end up marrying someone who is from, Taksal Jathebandi or something,
Yeah.
you see that, there are Panthic divides on there. And if there's couples getting married without their parents' approval and abuse starts there, and he starts saying, or she starts saying like her Jathabandi is better. This is how they grew up.
Yeah.
And then you have to erase everything that you've learned from birth.
Yeah.
Right? You're already being separated and outcasted from your Jathabandi, your family. Nobody in the Gurdwara wants to talk to you. None of your family wants anything to do with you. And you see that, spiritual abuse or religious abuse, casteism, all of these things start coming up within the marriage. And
that can be even more powerful.
Yeah.
Because we identify so strongly with our religion. I mean, that is your spirit.
Exactly.
That's your soul. And now it's something that you leave up to, like often we leave it up to Waheguru to take care of us when it comes to our spirituality. And then to have that be confronted or downplayed or forced into a different direction, you can start to blame Waheguru. You can start to blame God for the problems you're going through. And now you're putting yourself into a spiritual turmoil.
Right. And we've also seen situations where the whole concept of your karam or, what's happening to you, what's happening to me right now is based off of my past life, things that I've done in my, this is all related to my karam that could have been from, Pichle Janam de vich.
Right. And it's essentially a way of saying, maybe I deserve this.
Right. Like this is, God's way of making things right from a past life. So we've seen those different types of scenarios. And one last abuse that I want to touch on, which is more newly emerging, is technological abuse. And this is something that, as, people with technology is advancing.
Especially with phones. Yeah.
Yes. With phones, you're seeing that they're able to track people's phones, which we knew. We knew that, there's an ability to track people's phone. But one thing that we actually found out, which we didn't know was happening, was with technology in smart homes. A lot of our victims, because they were immigrants, they did not have driver's license. They had no way of getting outside of the house without, their husbands driving them. Or they may have only had one car. And so while the husband's out working, and if she was a homemaker, then she was staying home. But the husband in the smart homes had the ability to install, software cameras, constantly watching what she's doing. It was getting to the point where they would even regulate the temperatures within the home that, if they had a fight or in order to do abuse, they could turn off the AC in the house,
right?
Or they can make the temperature extremely hot. So these are new forms of abuse that we had never, we knew that the psychological, the verbal, the emotional abuse, we knew that those things existed, but this is like our new generation, new technology, and new ways that people have started doing things.
Yeah, and I imagine that's even a harder one to prove. Because to prove that the person is intentionally doing something as a form of abuse, when they could just say, no, I just have security cameras. I just watch what's going on. Or, I don't know what happened with the temperature during the day. When I got home, I fixed it. But it forces, but it continues that dependency on that person who is, in fact, the abuser.
Right. And I think that's something that even we're also trying to educate ourselves more about, on ways that we can combat that from happening. And then also, I didn't mention this, but this is something that just is not discussed, but sexual abuse within households.
Right.
That it also can tie in religious abuse, when we see, like, a lot of times people will use religion as a way, I'm your husband. We've seen in a case where there was a Muslim client who said that she never revealed that there was sexual abuse going on in the marriage. We found out when she was at her court hearing to get a protective order, when the attorney asked, was there anything else going on? And she said that, yeah, like he was holding me against my will. Like we had, we were doing intimate things that couples are supposed to do. He is my husband. This is what was supposed to happen. This is something
it's his right.
To.
Yeah,
right. It's his right as my husband. And this is this is our household issue. This is not something that I would want to share with other people. And that's how we found out that she was going through sexual abuse. We see that it's very common that people, a lot of women won't recognize or say that there is sexual abuse going on in the marriage because they believe that this is, their husband have every right. If they ask for sex, then, that's their right. Their duty as a wife, to be a good wife, is to do what they say in terms of that.
Yeah, so. I mean, definitely our community has a hard time talking about these things because part of it is just we've associated so much shame to that topic, to the topic in general, and then to specifically bring it up in the context of abuse. Now it's very easy for it to get turned around on the woman.
Exactly.
And that's unfortunate that happens a lot in Asian cultures in general, I think. But it is another one that needs to be addressed, or at least we need to talk about it and identify it so that we can say, here's what the whole picture looks like. And even though you define these as all distinct types of abuse, it really is an entire picture of abuse. Like probably all of those things happen to some degree, in an abusive situation. So they can all be indicators.
Right. And it's interesting because people use intersectionality to describe other things, but we also say that someone who is a victim, these forms of abuse, the victim could be going through all these types of abuse in different shapes and forms and not even know what the word domestic violence means because they were not taught about it. There's actually, we were discussing this, that in certain languages that there is no exact translation for the word domestic violence. Like in Hindi, in certain languages, you can describe it in different ways, but there's actually not an actual word for it.
Well, you could almost make the argument that it's funny that we even call it domestic violence. Why don't we just call it human rights violations?
Right. Well,
and the reason, but the reason we don't call it that is because nobody wants to look at themselves as a human rights violator.
Exactly. And even the term of saying that I'm an abuser, you don't see people self-claiming. They may say, yes, I did something wrong. This was a mistake.
Yeah, but I was out of control. I'm sorry. Right. There's a lot of that.
Like if you hadn't made me mad or if this situation didn't happen, then I would be fine. You know me, you know who I am.
Right.
But it's just different ways. It's very hard to look at in those situations for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, even in those cases, a lot of times you could say, okay, yeah, there's this intense situation going on, but you're the one that has power and lost control.
Yeah.
If you had been in that same situation with someone more powerful than you, right? That's the whole problem, is that it's always this power dynamic. Where do you fall in that? Because when you're in a situation where you're not the one with power, you're pretty quiet.
Exactly.
But then when you were the one with the power, you let loose, so it takes some type of self-reflection. So did you see that ever? Where the abuser realized the degree or the level of their actions and took things to correct themselves? And does that work?
Unfortunately, with all of the cases, we had, I believe, over 400 cases last year.
Wow.
And not one of them did we see that the abuser was trying to correct what mistake they had done.
Wow.
Unfortunately. And I myself...
Not a single one out of 400.
Not a single abuser. And there are court programs. We call ourselves part-time lawyers and investigators at our organization because, going to court, there were certain things that we would be there to represent them on different cases, whether it's a filing for a domestic violence protective order or, other things we were going through, but there was also an abuser anger management classes or abuser ratification behavior, something similar to those where they would send them. But we saw that even monitoring those, that there was no way to actually keep track if abusers were consistently going to those classes, and they could prolong them for as long as possible.
Well, even if they went, I can already imagine most of them would say, I'm just doing this because I'm ordered to, and I'm trying to get less jail time or penalty against me or whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think that one of the harder things also is because a lot of them had limited English proficiency, and many of them were immigrants, they would not have understood anything that was actually being talked about at those management classes, which would have delayed the process even more because they would need a translator present for them.
Yeah, so even though you had help on the victim side for South Asian people, on the education side for the abuser, there's no South Asian organization that's there to get that message across to them, to teach them, to help them identify where their anger is coming from and what is the proper tools to handle that. That doesn't exist. They're just thrown into the regular system with everybody else, and they may not be comprehending any of it.
Right. And I mean, I'm not exactly sure. It could be maybe some other states in the United States, like there may be a program for these abusers where they have South Asians present, but nothing in North Carolina, nothing that we have seen that there's actual, programs for these abusers to correct their behaviors or learn from their mistakes. And a lot of people would ask Kiran itself as an agency, why didn't we do that? Right. Why was it only that we were serving victims? We were being labeled as a divorce organization.
Basically, because you're encouraging divorce by siding with the victims.
That's odd.
But they're putting that expectation on you. It's like, oh, you're going to help the victims and not the victimizer.
Not the abusers. Yes. It's interesting that a lot of people would say that you guys are not helping couples get back together. You're making them get divorced. But you have to think from our situation, if there is a victim that's coming to us saying that they were literally beaten by their husband, their 2-year-old child had a knife to their throat, which is a real case. Wow. This is actually a real case that happened. What position would we be in to go tell them, no, you should go back home and patch things up with your husband? It's not up to us. If the victim chooses to do that, that's their choice. Right. We do not promote anyone to leave their family or to stay with their family. It all has to do with whoever comes in. They can explain to us what the situation is, and we help them depending on what they would like. A lot of times people would call us in just to talk to us. Yeah. They had never spoken to anybody before about what had happened.
Yeah. But even still, it's insane to think somebody put a knife to a 2-year-old's neck, and the expectation would be now on the person helping the victims to say, well, talk to the guy, explain to him why it's wrong to put a knife to a 2-year-old's neck, and see if he can learn the lesson and not continue to do this so they can have a happy marriage. That's insane. You would never do that. You would be like, that guy's a psychopath, and we need to protect these people from ever having to go back to that.
Exactly. But I think that it is so ingrained in our culture that no matter what happens, you stick it through, you fight for your marriage, you stay strong. And there's just a huge stigma around that. They believe
I understand that though. Honestly, I can understand that. And maybe if you're just privileged and you're lucky and things are good, it's easy to have that perspective because you feel like, I made this commitment in front of God and community. I made this commitment and I am somebody who keeps my commitments. I can understand that feeling, but at some point, like I said, a human rights violation is a human rights violation. And no point would you have said, like with 1984 and the Sikhs and Punjab police, at no point would you have said, but the police are supposed to protect society, but they were torturing these people. Maybe we talk to them and convince them to protect the people instead of torture them.
Right. But
that take that position.
Right. But that there's still people out there that believe, the situation wasn't as dire as it was.
Sure.
And that's the same thing with domestic violence. I don't think that people have the perception of how dangerous that things could potentially be, or that there's someone that's living their life feeling like they want to kill themselves every day from staying in that situation. And there's a lot of people, they just feel helpless, that they can't do anything. They don't have support. There are a lot of women that came from abroad that they don't have access to a driver's license. Their immigration status depends on their husband. So even if they wanted to leave, that would mean that, they would have to go through the whole law and order process on trying to figure out how that they could stay in the US without getting deported for violence that's being committed on them.
Yeah. And it's more than that too, because I've seen it here locally. We have a large growing Bangladeshi population. And what you're seeing is like these slumlords that what they'll do is they buy this cheap real estate. Okay. And when someone comes over here from, India or Bangladesh and these other areas, what they do is they put them to work like in their grocery stores and things like that. They tell them that, hey, I'm going to give you a house to live in. And they take the rent out of their paychecks, but they hang on to their papers.
Yep.
They take all their papers ahead of time. Now, imagine like the way the model of oppression works is, and this is oversimplifying it, I understand, but when you have a government that takes advantage of the people, and then you have business people or managers that take advantage of their employees, the employee goes home with the weight of that structure, that power structure on him to perform, be quiet and perform, otherwise face the wrath of his boss.
Right.
That guy has to go home and he's got all of that inside of him, and he's going to now take it out on his family. Right. So model of oppression works like that we saw that in Punjab, how that worked down to the abuse that was happening. It doesn't excuse anybody of any abuse. I don't want to imply that at all, but I'm just saying when we understand that that's how the model of oppression works, now you can start to work it backwards. You can start to say, you can't, this is what you need to do with the stress that you feel at work, dealing with people who are taking advantage of you, or this is how we need to restructure our society. Start to do these things so that we don't have this kind of model pushing down on people. Instead, we have a society where people help each other and they share the burdens. Yeah.
And that would be ideal. That would be amazing. Like if society were to do that, and we're kind of, the organization is kind of trying to do that starting with the youth. We feel that adults have gotten to the point where there's so much learned behavior. They're already ingrained in that system.
Right.
They're seeing the young kids are seeing what is happening with their parents. They're modeling that behavior. A daughter that is born into a family of abuse is 7 times more likely of being a victim herself.
Almost like she seeks it out.
Yes, because that
subconsciously speaking, like, exactly. The person feels normal in that environment because that's what they always saw.
Right.
7 times more likely.
Yes, that behavior is considered normal to her. What love looks like. That's what love looks like to her. Right. That, that's happening. But what we are trying to do is, Kiran had established these teen workshops where we talk to kids. We would get them into a group of doing an activity to kind of, break the ice a little bit, because we're not going to go into a group of kids and start talking about abuse and domestic violence. Right. But we would try to do like a rock climbing activity or something, and then relate it. And later on, we would do a group discussion on, what do healthy relationships look like versus non-healthy relationships? What is conflict resolution, different types of conflict, mediation, just to start educating the youth and potentially breaking these barriers, which are already ingrained in their families or households. And we saw that these cases, one specific case, there was a woman that had 7 children. Clearly there was sexual abuse going on in that family. But because we were working with them for so long, we saw that their children's behavior started to change. There was one son, the oldest, and 6 girls.
Wow.
The mom had started seeing that the son had started yelling at the younger sisters in a way to keep discipline within the household, because that's what he saw growing up.
I see.
So it's very, it's a very difficult situation to be in when you're going through it yourself, and then children that are seeing this as a part of their normal behavior, they're getting to that age where this is learned information, and trying to break that down, teach them, it's not black and white, it's not right and wrong, but, trying to teach them that behavior, what is healthy, what is not healthy.
But, those lessons can be taught to the older generation. I think you have to almost sneak it into them, though. Kind of like what you're saying, like you did an icebreaker, and then you talk about, what is healthy and what is not. That same technique works with older people too. You just have to sometimes sneak it in. If you go into it saying like, hey, today we're going to teach you why you're a jerk and an abuser, and this is how you can be nice, then obviously there's going to be a lot of walls that go up and people are going to be defensive. But if you were just to say, hey, here's a great way to handle a stressful situation with your boss.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden people are open-minded. They're like, oh yeah, I got to know this. My boss is a jerk and I want to know how to talk to him and not let him take advantage of me. And then maybe that conversation goes to, what would you tell your daughter if she was dating somebody who did that? I don't know. I'm just making this up as I go. I'm just saying, like, I think that kind of literally dragging someone through these scenarios where they can connect the dots later. And then eventually you can get to, can you think of ways that you behave like that boss or like that boyfriend or like, whatever. Mm-hmm. And because I know this is overly optimistic and I don't want anybody to think that I'm making light of anything, but ultimately we are an atma. We are a soul in this body that's reflective of what the ultimate creator is. And self-reflection and truth is going to pinch and hurt anybody, no matter who they are. So I don't like to say that anybody's a lost cause, but I understand why focusing on the children, creating that education now so that cycles can be broken and then future generations are behaving differently. That totally makes sense.
Right. And I think that, rehabilitation, we're not against rehabilitation at all.
Yeah.
And speaking from my own experience, I think that rehabilitation can do wonders for a lot of people. But again, it's up to the abusers themselves if that they're willing to do that.
Yeah.
If they're willing to have those sit down and those tough conversations. And there are agencies that exist that provide that help. But it's just, doing that work. I had been working with Kiran for 2.5 years. It's very, very rare that we saw, abusers wanting to change. Most of the time they were trying to manipulate the system in some sort of way to make either the victim's life harder, them getting away with keeping their immigration status and their working permit, or some way.
And their reputation. People are so worried about the reputations in their communities.
Right, exactly. Like that is something that we see more often so than someone that wanted to correct their behavior. Not saying that it's not possible, but it's just, this was the commonality that we saw. And we felt that, working more with the victims in order to put them in a place where they felt confident to go back into the world, being stronger, being healthier, happier, being able to work.
But really, ultimately, you guys were focused on the victim. That was the whole mission, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where the greatest need was.
Right. And that's kind of how Kiran had started. And it was conceptualized in 1998, but it didn't receive its first, grant and authorization till 2008. And
10 years.
Yes. It took 10 years for it to actually have a working office.
And then even then you were like 3 people.
Yeah. Well, in that time, in 2008, I think, the agents, at one point there was one person operating it by themselves. Because
where does the name Kiran come from? Was that the person, or was that
No.
because somebody that they knew that was abused? How did that name come about?
Yeah, so Kiran means the ray of light. So
Okay.
that's kind of the way that they saw, the organization wanted to be a ray of light
Okay, so
for
it wasn't a
victims that are
specific
coming
person.
in.
It wasn't somebody's name.
No,
I always thought it was someone's name. That's
yeah.
what I always thought. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of other organizations out there like Raksha and there are many other South Asian organizations in different states too. But this one specifically, that was the name that they wanted to stick with. And it all started from a group of women and some men. They felt that the need in the community was there and that they needed to establish an operation during that time. And so the work, it took forever to get to where they were, but it was a small group of people. And a lot of people had told them that there wasn't a need for this. I remember I did a presentation at the Gurdwara about domestic violence, and we got a lot of positive feedback. But at the end of the Divan, there were 2 or 3 uncles that came up to me and told me that you're so young. Why are you working for an organization like this? You should do something else with your career.
Really?
Yes. So as much as people support, you have your supporters, there are people out there that just feel like, this problem doesn't exist. The work that you're doing.
Often just stick your head in the sand. If you don't pay attention to it, it'll go away. The more you call it out, it's like racism. People say that about racism. Stop calling out racism because you're just fueling the fire. No, the actual racism is fueling the fire. We're just calling it out. It's the same thing with domestic violence. Domestic violence doesn't go away because you ignore it. It just goes hidden.
Exactly. And I feel that that's something that, when this is a far-fetched idea, but when camps or when other, organizations are thinking about content that they want to put out there and educating people, this is the type of stuff that needs to be considered.
Absolutely.
And because, Sikh history is important. I understand firsthand that how important it is for kids to know and have focus on these Sikh camps.
Yeah.
You learn a lot from that. But there's also these other things that are just not being talked about. If they're not talked about at a younger age group, you will see that it slowly disappears as they get older. It's just something that no one wants to talk about. It's silent, it's taboo. But it really needs to be incorporated in the curriculum as well.
I totally agree with you. And times are changing. I think 15, 20 years ago and earlier, very little was talked about. These things were shameful. They were embarrassing because it felt like you were failures. We know this case going on in DC with sexual abuse. Same thing, right? Like and I don't know if you watched that video of the parents talking about it, but they were very clear. They're like, the times were different. We didn't know what to do. We thought it was going to ruin reputations and all kinds of, and they just went quiet. But now they're speaking and they're saying things are different now. People are listening. People are thinking about these things differently. And it's the same thing with domestic violence. If people can think about it differently, then it should be talked about. It should be brought to light. That's the only way you're going to dispel darkness, is bringing light to it. And I guess that makes sense with the name Kiran now. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. That's what the Guru was. The Guru was bringing light to darkness, and this is just another aspect that needs to be covered. And I agree with you. There has to be some, but the thing is, I think the problem is we don't have the experts in these things to know how to approach it. Like even a lot of stuff you talked about today, I didn't know that. I didn't know all these things.
Yeah.
And so having people that actually know this, because they've worked in the organizations, they've seen the cases, they understand what's working and what's not working. They need to be brought in and be part of building that kind of information that can be distributed.
Definitely. And I think, the hard part is that our gurdwaras, the people, the sangat, there are some people that truly care about what's going on with some of these people. But I think that oftentimes sangat will form their own little committees to solve cases that are going on like this in marriages, or families will come together and try to solve these cases that are going out instead of having experts or official or people that actually have the experience in dealing with this. Because what it ends up turning into a lot of times is a lot of victim blaming, a lot of questioning as to why didn't you talk about this sooner? Why did you do this? Why did this happen? And as a way to mend the marriage. And I understand in some communities that can definitely help, if you don't want things to get out there. But a lot of times people who don't have the training, who don't have an understanding of what abuse looks like, or the different parts of, situations that can happen, it can oftentimes worsen those issues too.
Absolutely. But I think also for somebody who doesn't know any better, those are the natural questions. Right. That would be the natural thing. You're like, wait, that was happening. Why didn't you say something? What's going on here? And then you can almost be suspicious. Like, okay, I have to know for sure. Is this person trying to ruin this person's life? So I can understand the natural inclination to have those questions when you have no experience in any of this. But from listening to you today and from different people I've talked to, and, a lot of us that kind of grow up here and are educated here, we also learn things a little bit differently about what relationships are like and stuff, right?
Yeah.
I think that for us, it's like, no. You got to start from let's listen to the accusations, because it very easily goes the other way. It's very difficult to go this route. And I'll tell you, I work a lot with law enforcement. I've done all kinds of trainings with local police. I've worked with them, training them on diversity training, on helping them understand who the Sikhs are, how to handle Sikhs and things like that. And I remember there was a case many years ago now. It must be like 12, 15 years ago, I think now. But here locally, there was a husband who was abusive to his wife, and it ended with him burning her alive in the basement. The house burned down. He also died. I don't know if he shot himself or what happened, but something like that. It was bad, right? And the whole community was shocked. And the police were there. And I remember my friend who's an attorney, he was there to talk to the police. And one of the police officers asked him, he said, so does this kind of stuff happen a lot in your community? And he thought for a second. He said, you know what? Unfortunately, it does. We have domestic violence problems in our community. And the cop nodded. He goes, okay, good. I can trust you. Like essentially said, I can trust you because we get called to these kinds. We've been called here many times before, and we know your community hides these things. Yeah. And he needed to know that this was somebody. The cop was trying to figure out, can I talk to this person and trust them? Because most of them say, no. There's no,
nothing's going on here.
Peace-loving people. There's nothing here, and they don't like that. Law enforcement doesn't like that. It makes their jobs actually very difficult because now they got to figure out what's really going on, who's likely to cover things up, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you make a really good point. And that's also something that I had the opportunity to do, was work with law enforcement that was local to our area. We did domestic violence trainings with them. Yeah. And also just because it was interesting because some of the law enforcement officers were just like, we don't understand what's going on. We'll get a call to someone's house and the wife would have called, and the wife expect us to just yell at the husband a little bit and go away. Or they will try to hide the fact that anything happened in the first place. Right. What exactly is going on? And we see that one of the things that I see in this situation is a lot of times, because there are many immigrants that are coming, they relate policing similar to what was done in India.
Right. This is something I talk about with law enforcement too, is you got to understand that there may be distrust here because of where they come from. Yeah.
Yeah, that they will, they'll call them home and they'll expect them to yell at them and then go away, or things will get covered up by paying them money,
or bribing them. Yep.
Yeah. Or reports not actually being reported the way that they are. So those types of conversations are extremely important to have, not just with our community, but, with law enforcement, with public officials, that it's just the way that the culture is. There's a distrust in law enforcement. a lot of families believe that it's just an argument that's happening, and they want you to kind of be like a marriage counselor in a way.
Right.
We saw those cases a lot, and
which is the police are not trained for that.
Right. That's not something that you cover in policing. They understand, what domestic violence looks like, but the cultural aspect is a huge part of that.
Yeah, I mean, the police show up and they figure out that the husband has hit the wife. There's an arrest.
Yes.
That's why that's what the police do. If you wanted somebody to come and kind of just shame him and convince him not to do it again, you called the wrong number.
Exactly. And we've seen in North Carolina, being in part of the Bible state, laws here work a little bit differently in some cases, but we've seen that domestic violence cases are really hard to call for law enforcement officers, just because when they arrive at the scene, whoever has done the hitting, or if there's physical signs of abuse or anything, that person is going to be the one that's taken away.
Yes.
It's unfortunate to say, it's more than one, it's several cases where husbands have figured this out and they will scratch themselves they will harm themselves to make it look like the wife had attacked him, or if the wife was fighting back, if the victim, he was trying to do something and she was fighting
defending
herself, that she's actually the one that's gotten arrested. Wow. And it's happened several times. And so that also, if you have those examples, there's this fear that's very manipulative. Yeah. Yeah. There's this fear that happens that, this is such and such thing happened with somebody else, that is it really worth calling law enforcement to do this? And people are getting smarter with the laws. Unfortunately, as much as the movies like to show us that justice is always served and things work.
I don't think anybody believes that.
Yeah,
nobody's brainwashed to think that justice is. We all operate on justice is very elusive, and the smarter, richer guy is the one that's going to get away with it.
Right, but in clear-cut cases, you would think that a serve or a hearing is going to go a specific way, but that's what ends up happening.
Case. Wow.
Yeah, you may have a clear-cut case where you believe. I remember we were sitting in court, and one of our victims' cases was going on for 2 months. 2 months of just getting a protective order.
Wow. God, so much can happen in 2 months. Exactly. Trying to get a protective order, you have to wait 2 months. Anything can happen in 2 months. That's a long time. 2 days. You don't want to wait 2 days for a protective order.
Exactly, because someone could actually be killed in that amount of time. If that were to happen. But you would think that there are certain clear-cut cases and the victim ends up getting nothing in the end. And that's where it goes to show we're trying to create that education and that process for our judges that are in North Carolina in the system. But there's certain laws here, just because it's the Bible state, that judges also believe that a husband and wife should work together. Automatically, when there are children being involved in these cases, in victims of domestic violence, custody is going to be 50-50. I know in other states like California and New York, they're much more open-minded about it. But specifically in North Carolina, does it matter what's happened? Custody will be 50-50 unless it's a dire circumstance. But we've even seen...
Which becomes difficult to prove. You're saying even simple to prove ones aren't going the way you want. Something that's so difficult to prove would be even more difficult to get the judge to go your way. Right.
And the interesting thing is, a lot of people, there's this whole thing, about our rights being upheld as Americans. And we see this in our courts and justice system too, where we had this one case that the child of the victim, the abuser, had left bullets of a gun with the child, and the abuser, he was an abuser, and he was letting the child play with the bullets of the gun. When that went to case, typically in instances of domestic violence, the judge will ask that the abuser forfeit any type of firearms or anything of that case. But in this case, he was allowed to keep his gun. And so we're seeing those types of loopholes come into the system depending on, is it a violation of my right to bear arms?
Right. That becomes a tough standard to prove because you have this constitutional right and people argue that too, just by committing a crime. I mean, actually, we argue this on the other side about voting, right? We say you have a right to vote. Just because you commit a crime doesn't mean your right should necessarily go away. It's not a privilege that's being removed. And people could argue that about the right to bear arms, that you can't take this away from me. You are not the one that's actually endowing me with this right.
Exactly. And
that's crazy though.
So
it's tough.
Yeah, we see domestic violence play in various different parts, within the home, within society, within their social groups and settings,
and policy and legislation.
And policy, in the court of law.
Yeah.
So we see that it's not just a situation that's happening at home. There are many different situations that are being there. And even with immigration status, if someone is coming in on a dependent visa, and if she doesn't have a work authorization document allowing her to work, it makes it even harder for her because she's financially dependent on her husband.
Right.
She is not able to have her own income, probably doesn't have a driver's license. If she's on an H-4 visa, she can't even open up her own bank account.
Right.
So you see that there's so many things in place within the system that makes it even difficult. So
there are roadblocks. There are obstacles that make it more difficult for justice. Instead of focusing on those things and removing these obstacles to make it easier for victims to get help, we just kind of brush it under the rug and just hope nobody pays attention to it.
And luckily, we, as an organization working in Kiran, we were able to work with other agencies and figure out ways of immigration relief and know that there are options out there. It's just very difficult because the common community doesn't know that there is something that's called a WAVA self-petition that they can file for.
Yeah, what is that? I don't even know what are you talking about?
Yeah, so if in an instance of an abuse, if there's domestic violence happening and abuse happening, if the victim is on a dependent visa, and the husband is a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, they can file for what is called a WAVA self-petition, which is it was created under the Violence Against Women's Act. And it's a form of immigration relief where instead of staying with the husband and having to endure that abuse, they can file for this, and it will allow them to attain their own green card so that they will be able to stay within the United States instead of being reliant on them.
Wow. Okay.
And so, unfortunately,
that's really good information.
Yeah. It's really great for those, if the abuser is a citizen, that they're able to find this immigration relief. However, for someone, a lot of times with the clients we had, husbands were on an H-1B visa or H-1 visa, which is a work visa.
Yeah, it's a temporary.
It's a temporary visa. And so for them, they would apply for a U visa, which allows them, it doesn't matter what the immigration status is of the husband, she can still apply for that. But an application for that, because it's part of just general crimes, it's taking 6 to 7 years for your application to even get looked at.
Wow.
Yeah. So these relief forms are out there. And the reason why I wanted to provide that is I know we talked about a lot of like the issues in our community, the problems that people face, but knowing that, we try to provide this education to the community because the community doesn't even know these options exist.
Yeah, these are the solutions. These are parts. These are parts on how we can change things and what we can do about it instead of just talking about it all the time.
Exactly, and I think that education, advocacy, those are the important things that we can do. A lot of people ask, well, what can we do? But just being an advocate for people out there. If you see someone that is exhibiting those signs or you think something's going on, it's always good to try to have them get help in any ways that they can.
And I know you mentioned that it can be men or women that are abusers or victims, but most of the time we're talking about men. And I just think the male ego, like I really feel like it's so important for you to, you already talked about camps and retreats, and organizations should be, Sikh organizations should be working more on this. And there are some organizations out there.
Yeah.
But it's so difficult. The male ego is so fragile. It's so sensitive. If you come at them as you are the victimizers, you guys are the, whatever, they're going to be, me too. We're going to be defensive, right? We're going to be like, well, not me. I'm not like that. And you can't just lump us all together. It's the typical defensiveness.
Yeah.
It has to be a backdoor approach. Like I was saying, you gotta walk them around the block, all the way around and then come back. Actually that reminds me of this joke. And this is not a joke to make light of things. I don't want anybody to get the wrong impression. This is to make this particular point. There's these two brothers. They live in, I don't know, Wisconsin or something. And the one brother, I'm going to just make their names. We're going to say Bobby and Ricky. Okay. Two brothers. So Bobby decides he's going to go on a trip to Italy for 2 months. Okay. So he calls his brother Ricky and he says, "Hey, Ricky, can you watch my cat while I'm gone? I'm going to land in Italy day after tomorrow. And I need somebody to come over here every once in a while, feed the cat, just make sure everything's okay." So Ricky's like, "Okay, fine, I'll do that." So Bobby's getting on the plane to go, and he just kind of checks in with Ricky. He goes, "Hey, did you get the key and everything?" He goes, "Yeah, dude, sorry, but bad news. The cat got out and got hit by a car." He's like, "What?"
Yeah.
He's like, "Yeah." He goes, "I just opened the door and the cat ran out." He's like, "Oh, geez. How am I supposed to enjoy this trip? I'm going to be gone for 2 months. I'm already on the airplane. I can't believe this happened." He goes, "Did you have to tell me now?" He's like, "Well, what did you want me to do?" He goes, You should have told me like the cat got stuck on the roof, and that you got it down. And then a week from now, when I call, check in, you could have said, "Hey, the cat seems like it's got a little sniffle or something, and it's hacking up these hairballs and it doesn't sound good." And I would have told you what to do. And then a week later, I could have called back and you could have said, "Hey, the cat's got fleas. I had to take it to the vet to get it taken care of. But, the cat's kind of looking sick. I don't know what's going on." Just drag it out so that by the end of my trip, before I heading home, you could have told me, "Hey, the cat passed away." He goes, "Then that way I could have enjoyed my trip and I could have gotten used to the idea that this cat is not doing well and it's kind of sick." He's like, "Oh, dude, sorry. I didn't know. I was just being honest." He goes, "Well, anyway, how's mom doing?" His mom got stuck on the roof.
Oh, man. Nice. That is an Uncle Rick joke right there. That is you.
But the point of that is you got to walk people around. Sometimes you can't go at them straight on because it's hard for them to accept. Right.
Yeah. And we acknowledge that. It definitely trying to get men involved in supporting the organization or even talking about these issues. We had to create a special campaign just for men to get involved. It was the men's social media campaign that we had where we contacted men and asked them, if they could provide why they support Kiran or what are some, what are their thoughts about domestic violence. Yeah. And we would share that. They would share it with their friends. So it was kind of a way to get community involved, see, okay, this guy has openly talked about supporting this. Maybe it's okay for me to also support it too, because there are supporters. I'm not hating on guys at all or men or bashing them. But a lot of times,
I think that's the impression a lot of men have about these kinds that we're just going to get bashed or whatever. And that's not the case. It's not the case.
Right. Even if they speak out, they feel like they're not doing justice to the cause, or they'll feel like they have no right to say anything since they are men that this is happening, or a lot of times they just think it's uncool. If they were to talk about it, they'll get shamed for it. But if they see somebody else is talking about it, and they will like it, they'll share it, they'll give their 2 cents in it. So that's kind of the strategy that we started out with that. And with that campaign happening, It's really weird. We did that campaign for a year, did not have a single male client, but literally a month later, we had 3 male victims come forward about abuse that they were going through. They
experienced, yeah.
Yeah. And
so it worked. It did work.
Yeah. Which was, it's very optimistic thinking to think that maybe this would make a change. You know, we don't know who's watching our social media. We're a small organization in North Carolina trying to get started. You know, we just expanded to Charlotte. How much is this really going to get out there? But it worked. And it's really weird. But one of the male clients I actually worked with, because he was Punjabi, he spoke Punjabi. He was from the Pakistan side, from Punjab. And he was the last client that I worked with, probably the one that made the most impact on my life, because he had experienced domestic violence in a different way. He also experienced sexual abuse. It was extremely hard for him to even talk about that with me. He would not say it. But I remember we had him sit down at a therapist session, and I had to translate on his behalf. Yeah. And that's where it came out. Oh, wow. So, you know, it just goes to show, again, we have this perception of what it looks like. Right. But it really could be anyone going through it. And men speaking up about it, it works. Even if it's a share on social media, we have to start small. It's not going to be you can parade into your gurdwaras and men start talking about, you know, abuse. But even the smallest instances of support, it really does make a difference.
That's good to know. As a matter of fact, if you can send me whatever links and stuff, I'll make sure they're linked into the description and stuff for this episode. Yeah, you know, and hopefully can gain some traction. And I hope people listen. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff today, and we've been talking for quite a while. Yeah. And I'll let you go here, but I hope people do listen and take these things to heart. None of us are perfect. We're all on like some spectrum of where we fall on these issues, like what our relationship to these issues are. A lot of us, we probably have things that we need to self-reflect on, how we talk, how we act, and how that's making the other person feel. You know, I know that you opened my eyes to some things that I feel like I need to pay attention to, because I don't want that creeping in, and I don't want my children seeing that and then having those expectations when they grow up and have relationships.
Exactly. And I don't think that parents realize that their children are watching and listening. And I remember even as a kid, it's the smallest things that we notice. Our kids are our future generations. If they grow up seeing this stuff, or even if they are seeing this stuff and their parents are choosing to change their behaviors or have these conversations, those conversations make an impact. Right. And I can't emphasize that enough, that, you know, we say, of course, we want to help adults in their behaviors. We're helping the adults survive. We're helping them get to a point where they're good in their life, but we want to educate and grow the youth because they are our future generation. Right. We want them to make better decisions than what the previous generation did.
Yeah. And that's something that parents, as a parent, I think all parents want that. They want, we want our kids to make better decisions than us and live happier, healthier lives. And that includes the relationships they're in, that includes their spirituality, their financial status, you know, all of those things. It's all part of it. And I think you made a great point about this needs to be an integrated part of what we learn. How do we handle the relationships in our lives? We should learn this along with Sikh history and Gurmat, and it should all be tied together. We can see clues from the Guru.
Right. Guru Nanak Dev Ji literally bashed every type of norm that there was. I like to, and this is just my thinking, but I like to believe our religion was born out of rebellion on things that, what was considered normal in society, bending gender norms, bending religious norms, all of that. Domestic violence clearly has a place in that too. Guru Sahib has taught us to respect one another. No one is above each other. And that should hold a place in our marriages as well. The relationships that we have as husband and wife, or, you know, intimate partners. That teachings, those learnings should be applied there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Keerat Kaur, you are wise beyond your years. I can't believe the little baby that I knew is married now and understands
Adulting.
such. Yeah, you're adulting great. I mean, I learned a lot today, and I think that's a testament to exactly what you're saying. The younger generations are getting educated. They're learning things that our generation didn't even learn, and the generations before us aren't even like in the same realm in many ways. So it's great that this kind of information is coming out, and I really, really appreciate you coming on and talking to me about this. And I hope people watch this and share this and try to understand. And, if there's anything that during all of this that I said that maybe is, not respectful or somehow viewed as making light of anything, I hope nobody thinks that. I don't feel that way, but a lot of this was new to me too.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I'm also digesting it, and I really, really appreciate you coming on and talking about it.
Thank you. I appreciate being given this platform to talk about these things and educate others. Again, I've only had this experience for this amount of time. And if there's anything that I may have said that offended anyone or anything like that, I would definitely recommend having those conversations here too. But I really I feel like this was super educational. And even the perspectives you gave me, I thought that, I learned something new as well.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. I'm going to let you go. Keerat Kaur, thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa.
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.